everyone. I'm Jonathan Lee, pastor of Grace Point Austin Church, and I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. William Lane Craig for this workshop on the case for the resurrection.
Yes.
Dr. Craig is currently a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in California, as well as professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University in Texas, but he lives and works out of Atlanta. And his ministry, reasonablefaith.org, has helped so many of us. Many times when I get a tough question that I can't answer, I just send them the link to your website directly, Dr. Craig. So I'm so thankful for your ministry. Dr. Craig, to get started, you're arguably the expert on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, with years and even decades of study on this topic. Can you take us back to why you decided to pursue this field as your second doctorate? You already have a doctorate in hand, and then now you want to pursue a second doctorate, and you pick this field. Why did you select that?
I had finished my doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, England, under John Hick, writing on the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And I was and remain convinced that this is a sound argument for a personal creator of the universe. Now, as a Christian, one isn't content to rest with mere theism. One would like to advance to Christian theism. And so as I thought about how one might go about arguing a case for Christian theism, it seemed to me that the resurrection of Jesus was absolutely central. If this is a historical event, then it would be like a divine imprimatur or vindication of the radical personal claims for which Jesus was crucified, showing that God had confirmed those claims. And so after finishing my work at Birmingham, I wanted to go to Germany and work under one of the world's leading experts on the historicity of the resurrection, Wolfhard Pannenberg, at the University of Munich. And so we applied there, were accepted, received a fellowship, and spent 2 wonderful years in Germany studying full-time the historicity of Jesus' resurrection.
During your study, what were some of those aha moments in your many days and nights reading and studying and laboring?
Well, there were primarily 2, I think. One at the very beginning of my study and one near the end. At the beginning of this research, I had really very little understanding of how credible, historically, the resurrection of Jesus really is. My familiarity with a historical argument for Jesus' resurrection extended really no farther than something like Frank Morrison's Who Moved the Stone, where one argues that the empty tomb of Jesus needs to be explained, and it couldn't be explained by the disciples stealing the body, nor the Roman authorities stealing the body, nor the Jewish authorities stealing the body. So the best explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And I had little understanding of the historical basis for belief in Jesus' resurrection beyond that. And what my research revealed to me is that, in fact, the resurrection of Jesus enjoys multiple lines of independent evidence in support of such facts as the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the Christian faith. And the second aha moment came near the end of my study, where, having marshaled all of this evidence in support of these facts, it dawned upon me that these conclusions were not peculiar or exclusive to conservative or evangelical theologians, but rather these facts represented the conclusions of the wide majority of historical Jesus scholars today, including Jewish and secular scholars who teach at non-evangelical universities and seminaries. And so that was a real confirmation to me of how truly persuasive this evidence is, that the wide majority of scholars today are convinced of the historicity of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so the only remaining question really is, how do you best explain those facts?
Mm-hmm. Well, you kind of got into a little bit of the case for the resurrection already in
did.
those aha moments, but I know you've given like an hour-long lecture on this topic before, and on your website you have the two wonderful animation videos on this topic that I encourage everybody to watch. And in fact, at the end of this workshop, during the break, we're going to show those two back to back. So it's going to present the case for the resurrection. But for the sake of this short workshop, if you could distill down the case to 7 minutes flat, it's kind of an appetizer of sorts.
Okay. A case for the resurrection of Jesus is composed of two steps. First, establishing the facts to be explained, and then second, inferring the best explanation of those facts. Now, with respect to establishing the facts to be explained, it seems to me that the plethora of evidence can be summarized under three broad headings. Number one, that after his crucifixion and interment, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his female followers on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion. Number two, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people under a variety of circumstances and at various locales experienced appearances of Jesus alive. And number three, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. And I want to emphasize that I'm just summarizing here. Under each of those 3 points, there would be multiple lines of independent evidence going to establish each point. And as I mentioned, the wide majority of New Testament scholars today agree with the historicity of those 3 facts. So the question then is, how do you best explain these facts? And here, what we do is to assemble a pool of live explanatory options. And then we weigh these explanations by the standard criteria that historians use for assessing historical explanations. Factors like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, and so forth. And I argue that when you assess the rival hypotheses by these criteria, the best explanation that emerges is the one that the original disciples gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead.
Now, as you presented this like hundreds of times, I'm sure you had plenty of opposition to the case that you presented. What are some of the common challenges to this argument that you've heard over the years, and how have you responded to those?
Well, among scholars, that is to say, those who know the evidence, there is not a lot of dispute with regard to those 3 facts to be explained. Rather, where these scholars will pull up is with respect to accepting a miraculous or supernatural explanation of those facts. For many, perhaps even most scholars, they will say that historians, as historians, are methodologically bound to only naturalistic explanations. And therefore, as historians, they cannot even consider a supernaturalistic or miraculous explanation like God raised Jesus from the dead. And so for most of them, they are simply left with agnosticism, with a question mark. They will say, we don't know how to explain these 3 facts. They won't adopt or advocate a rival explanation. They will simply say, we can't say as historians. Now, the way in which I would respond to that is to say that even if it is true that a professional historian, as an historian, has to work within this sort of methodological blinders, I'm a philosopher, and I'm not committed to working within such methodological constraints. Indeed, I think as a human being, I'm not bound by those kind of constraints and can ask the question, well, what is the best explanation for these facts? And if a supernatural explanation is the best, then as a human being and as a philosopher, I am perfectly free to adopt such an explanation, even if the professional historian, as a historian, rather than as a private person, cannot embrace such an explanation.
This case seems pretty good, but what do you think makes it so hard for some people to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, even though there are many sound, valid reasons to believe?
I think it's a resistance to miracles. If Jesus rose from the dead, we are postulating a miracle of enormous proportions. And for many people who are schooled in naturalism or scientism, a miraculous explanation is just incredible for them. And I think in that case, what we need to do is to take a step back and look at the evidence and arguments for God's existence. I'm persuaded that there are multiple sound arguments for a personal creator and designer of the universe who is the paradigm of absolute moral goodness. And if you come to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus with the assumption of theism, then there can simply be no a priori objection to a miraculous explanation because you've already got God in your worldview. So to quote Peter Slezak, atheist philosopher in Australia that I debated, if God exists, then he says the odd resurrection is child's play. So it really does hinge, I think, on whether or not you've got good reasons to believe that God exists. Because if you do, once you've crossed the Grand Canyon between atheism and theism, then it's a small gap to get from theism to Christian theism.
Mm-hmm. And that cycles you to your first dissertation topic.
It does. That's exactly right. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, the ontological argument. And in this same series of animated videos that you referred to, the videos on Jesus and the resurrection are simply the capstone to a whole series of prior videos on the credibility of theism and these arguments for God's existence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I really recommend to everyone watching this, don't do it right now, but after this workshop is done, get onto reasonablefaith.org and watch every single one of those, and you'll see how well it's put together. Now, at this point, I want to just shift gears a little bit here to give you a chance to address the college students in particular, because this is a conference and a retreat for college students. From the early days of your ministry, you've had a big heart for college campus ministry. And so one thing that I just was curious about is if you could start college all over again as an 18-year-old in the year 2020, minus the COVID and everything, but if you were to start it all over again, what would you do more of and what would you do less of?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer because I became a Christian my junior year in high school. And so when it came time to going to university, I deliberately chose a Christian college so that I could integrate my education with my newfound faith. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience to build a Christian world and life view that included a Christian perspective on the arts, on the sciences, on mathematics, on history, and so forth. And that is a wonderful project. I would encourage all of the students, even those who don't have the advantage of attending a Christian institution, to try to do this kind of integrative work where you don't put your brains in one pocket and your faith in the other pocket and never let them see the light of the day at the same time. Rather, try to have an integrative worldview that will combine faith and learning. So that was a great asset to me that I would certainly do over. Let me say as well, on a personal level, and these comments are directed particularly to the Christian students that are watching today, I would really urge you during these years to guard yourself by keeping yourself sexually pure and chaste. And this is especially important in your relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend. When you love another person, the desire to be physically united is so powerful, so natural, that if you begin to open the door to that, it can soon overwhelm and dominate your relationship. And I can guarantee you that you're going to save yourself a world of hurt if during these years you can simply restrain yourself and to keep yourself chaste and to keep your relationship pure. You will never regret that later after you marry and experience the fullness of sexual relationships. But during those years where you're single, I would just urge you to save yourself a lot of grief by keeping yourself pure and chaste during this time.
Wow, Dr. Craig, I wasn't expecting that advice, but I could really tell that that's from your experience in helping college students as a minister and really leading them in all aspects of their faith journey. And so I really appreciate that candid
Certainly.
remark. Now, as you interacted with many college students through your speaking engagements, what concerns do you have about this particular generation of college students with regards to their faith and their intellectual life? Because you've really invested a big portion of your life and continue to in equipping us intellectually with the reasons to believe and all of that. And especially as you see the college campus students, what concerns do you have about this?
Well, we live in an American culture, it's no secret, that is deeply, deeply divided. And this is evident especially on university campuses. The forces of secularism are extremely militant and extremely intolerant of Christian believers and Christian belief and values. And so I think that it is imperative, as never before in an increasingly secular culture and university environment, that we be able to defend the truth of what we believe. I would encourage every Christian in the audience watching today to have in his arsenal at least 3 arguments for the existence of God that he can share with an unbeliever from memory and can defend their premises and answer potential objections that are typically raised against these arguments. And then in addition to that, I would encourage him to have memorized a case for belief in Jesus and his resurrection from the dead, such as I outlined just a moment ago, and then be able to answer the principal objections to that. If we are able to do that, I think it will have a tremendous leavening effect upon our culture. It will make the gospel an intellectually credible option for thinking men and women today. Now, they may not come to Christ because of the arguments, but what the arguments will do is give them the intellectual permission to believe and to follow their hearts when the Holy Spirit speaks to them and they hear the gospel, because they know that in coming to believe in Christ, they are not committing some sort of intellectual suicide. And so these arguments can create a cultural milieu in which Christian belief is a perfectly rational thing to do. And so I would really encourage all of us Christians to have in our equipment this sort of apologetic case ready to present at the drop of a hat when called upon to do so.
Now, how about some advice that you would give to non-Christian seekers who are investigating and coming to Bible studies in church to kind of check out what Christianity is all about? What advice would you have for them?
I would encourage them not just to look at atheistic resources on YouTube. There is a lot of garbage on the internet. Anybody can put up his video on YouTube and get thousands of views. And so you hear the silliest stuff out there, for example, that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, or that Jesus was a mythological figure based upon Egyptian myths of Horus and Osiris and things of this sort. And what the students need to understand is that no scholar, no professor at an American university would defend these sorts of sensationalistic, popularistic things that are on YouTube. So I would encourage them to be very careful about getting good resources by bona fide experts in the field. And I would encourage them to look at some of the things that I've published in this area, such as my book, Reasonable Faith, or on a more elementary level for beginners, my book On Guard. And then to see how non-believers would react to these arguments, they can go and look at YouTube videos of the debates that I have participated in on secular university campuses. I have debated the principal spokesman for atheism, agnosticism, and secularism today, people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Bart Ehrman, and on and on and on. And I am confident enough in these arguments to refer students to these debates and say, you make up your own mind where you think the evidence points.
You mentioned that you became a Christian a little before entering into college, and chances are many of the attendees and viewers haven't heard your story of how you yourself became a Christian, how you wrestled with a lot of questions and all of that.
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing with us your story?
Not at all. I was not raised in a Christian family or even a church-going home, though I want to add that it was a loving and warm home. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask what I call the big questions in life. Who am I? Where am I going? What is the meaning of my existence? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a large local church in our community. Only problem was, instead of answers, what I found was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate, and the other high school students who pretended to be such good Christians on Sunday lived the rest of their week for their real God, which was popularity. And they would do anything in the service of that God. And this deeply troubled me because I thought, here, externally at least, I'm leading a better life than they are. And yet I'm so spiritually empty inside. They must be just as empty as I am, but they're all pretending to be something they're not. They're all a pack of hypocrites. And so I began to become very angry and bitter toward the institutional church. And soon this attitude spread toward other people. Everybody, I said, is a hypocrite. They're all holding up plastic masks to the world while the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I began to be very bitter and angry with other people. I said, I don't want anything to do with other people. I don't need them. And I threw myself into my studies and shunned relationships with others. I was on my way to becoming, frankly, a very alienated young man. But in moments of honesty and introspection, as I looked into my own heart, I realized that deep down, I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized in that moment I was just as much a hypocrite as they were, because here I was putting on this brave face, pretending not to need other people, when deep down inside, I knew I really did crave loving relationships with others. And so that anger turned in upon myself for my own phoniness and hypocrisy. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just gnaws away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. And I remember one day I was feeling particularly crummy, and I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind this girl who was one of these types, you know, that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said to her, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, well, Bill, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what do you want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and hatred inside. And she said that there was someone who really loved me. And who was it? But the God of the universe. And that thought just staggered me, to think that the God of the universe could love me, Bill Craig, that worm down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. I just couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night and I found a New Testament that had been given to me by the Gideons when they visited my grade school in the 5th grade. And for the first time in my life, I opened it and began to read the Gospels. And as I did, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about this man's teaching that I'd never encountered before. And there was an authenticity about his life that was not characteristic of these people that were attending that local church that I was going to. And I realized then I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, to make a long story short, I went through about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I've ever been through in my life. I read books. I read the New Testament from cover to cover. I sought God in prayer. I attended Christian meetings. And at the end of those 6 months, I basically came to the end of my rope. And I just cried out to God one night. And as I did so, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I remember I rushed outside. It was a warm Midwestern September evening. And as I looked up at the evening sky, you could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And as I looked up at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life. Because you see, I had thought enough about this message to realize that if it were really the truth, then I could do nothing less than spend my entire life sharing this message with mankind, because it is the greatest news ever announced. And so my call to full-time Christian ministry was simultaneous with my conversion experience. And since that night, I've never looked back, but have shared the good news of Jesus with university students all over the globe on university campuses. I love to share this news with students who are about the same age that I was when my life was turned upside down.
Well, I'm so thankful for Sandy, who
Yes.
spoke those words to you at that opportune time. I mean, who knew that that was exactly what you needed to hear? And as I'm thinking about all of the students watching this video right now, maybe there's someone in this audience who needs to hear exactly what you said, and they could be the next Dr. William Lane Craig.
Yes. You never know.
You never know. As we wrap up this workshop, we wanted to just share some resources for next steps. And so you probably have, I could see all those books behind you in the bookcase. If you were to recommend for someone who just has a couple hours to invest into the case for the resurrection, what would be those key resources you would point them to?
I would recommend my book, On Guard. This book is like the tip of an iceberg that represents an enormous amount, really a career of research, but it's distilled down to a very simple presentation that is easily mastered and memorized. So that would be my recommendation, would be my book, On Guard.
Okay. Now, how about for someone who wants to get a little bit deeper? How about if they had like 10 hours to invest? What would you add to that?
Well, the next step I would recommend would be my book, Reasonable Faith. It covers much of the same material as On Guard, but in much greater depth and with much greater interaction with contemporary scholarship. So that would be the next step, I think, to graduating in your study of the defense of the Christian faith.
Okay. Well, our time is up, and I just want to thank you, Dr. Craig, for not only investing hours and tens of hours, but tens of years and your entire lifetime to help us to grow in our faith and our faith in Jesus Christ, who is our risen Lord and Savior. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Craig. If we could have all of the audience just clap even where they're at. You don't get to hear it right now, but perhaps in heaven you'll get to hear it one day. Amen.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Bye.
Bye-bye.